Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, the cost of living and a dire warning from the World Bank. Millions are being driven into extreme poverty as food prices soar. We speak to the World Bank's managing director. While Iraq takes the unusual step of combating its food crisis by cancelling an order for US fighter jets. And in other business news, Nokia teams up with Microsoft. It's either a technology dream team or an attempt to survive. We look at the changing face of the technology sector. So very much a program of two halves this week, because while some of us have all we need, a lot don't. And that includes the basics, food. You know, global food prices are rising to dangerous levels, threatening tens of millions of poor people. And that's not us saying that. That's Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, a group which also says the number of undernourished people in the world is now approaching 1 billion. What's really scary, though, is how quickly it is getting worse. According to the World Bank, 44 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty since June of last year. The bank defines extreme poverty as those people living on less than $1.25 a day. And between October and January, its food price index has risen 15%, making that $1.25 even more paltry. So here's how we're breaking it down this week on Counting the Cost. We've got that interview with Ngozi Nkonjo-Iweala, who is the Managing Director at the World Bank. Lawrence Lee will have a report from London on the part that speculators are playing in driving up prices. And Scott Heidler's been to a commodities trading floor in Chicago to see how the whole pricing system actually works. But we're going to start in Iraq, where there is rising anger over a lack of public services and government cuts in food rations. New parliament there is grappling with a $13 billion deficit, but it was also going to buy a bunch of fighter jets from the US. Now, though, there is a change in the air. Jane Araf with this report from Baghdad.
American fighter jets or food? Looking at these protests, it's easy to see what choice the Iraqi government would make. Facing a huge budget deficit, they've announced they're delaying the purchase of 18 F-16s and will use the $900 million to help the poor. Almost daily protests here, even among the middle class, have focused on lack of services and cuts in food rations. This in a country which has some of the world's biggest oil reserves.
30% of the Iraqi people are under the poverty line. Their income is under $2 a day. How can this be justified?
Since 1991, in response to international trade sanctions that lasted more than a decade, the Iraqi government has provided every citizen with food at virtually no cost. It's basic stuff: rice, flour, cooking oil. But millions of the poor depend on it. With the budget problems, corruption, and mismanagement, those rations have been getting smaller and smaller. And Iraqis have been getting angrier and angrier. There's no water, no electricity for 15 days. Flour stopped 5 months ago. There's no sugar, there's no tea, says Zahra Hussein, a widow who supports 10 people. F-16s like these, sold last year to Pakistan, were to have been at the center of a new Iraqi Air Force, which would eventually be able to defend Iraq's airspace. The head of Parliament's Economic Committee, a member of the opposition Iraqi bloc, says if it weren't for corruption, Iraqis could afford the fighter jets.
In the previous budget, billions of dollars were assigned for the ration card, but because of a layer of politicians and ministry employees who regretfully did not deal with this money honestly, the ration system almost collapsed.
The United States had been counting on the contract as a continued foothold in Iraq, as well as a boost to its defense industry. The Iraqi military had hoped to rebuild its air force, but so far it's not Iraqi pilots who are demonstrating in the streets.
And now to the two reports we mentioned earlier. In a moment, the mechanics of the commodities market with Scott Heidler in Chicago. First, though, the increasing accusations that the very same banks, the hedge funds, the financiers whose speculation caused the subprime mortgage crisis, and we know what that did, they're the ones apparently causing food prices to yo-yo and inflate. Lawrence Lee has more on that.
There are lots of things which lead to food shortages. Floods, fire, drought, civil unrest are all assumed to cause hunger and misery for the poorest in the world. What's less well known is the extent to which the actions of some of the world's richest money men compound problems which are already bad enough. This street is in one of London's richest areas, Mayfair. This anonymous building houses a hedge fund, which is an investment vehicle for millionaires. Here, the actions of just a few people had global implications. One day last year, the people who work in the hedge fund here had a brilliant idea. They bought 240,000 tonnes of cocoa on the London Commodities market, 7% of the world's supply. Having cornered the market, they then simply stored all the cocoa in warehouses. The price of chocolate reached its highest level for more than 30 years. This is how prices of wheat and grain have risen so much. The hedge fund wouldn't talk to us, but a few are prepared to break the code of silence among traders. This man used to work in the City of London, but then appeared anonymously in newspaper columns, becoming famous by blowing the whistle on the behaviour of the financial markets.
To them, food is just an asset, just like an equity or a bond or anything else like that, or a currency, and they have no regard whatsoever that for other people it's whether they live or die. So it really, I'm afraid, is a ruthless place, and there is a general cynicism in the city and in finance generally.
Deregulation of the commodities markets has meant the same financial institutions which caused the financial crash now trade staple foods which keep much of the world from starvation, just like oil or gold. Whenever there's a crisis, like a flood or a drought, traders bet against the price of food going up or down. Critics say they systematically distort prices to make money.
In moral terms, I would describe their behavior as completely immoral. Every economic decision does have a moral consequence, and the bankers' actions don't pay attention to what happens on the ground as food prices go up. Food is a fundamental human right. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold like any other.
It's an open question whether proposed banking reforms could stop commodity speculation from turning crises into potential disasters. But one thing is certain. In places like Tunisia or Algeria, hungry people cause civil unrest. And that in itself should be enough for Western governments to worry.
We're here on the floor of the CME Group where commodities are traded, agricultural commodities are traded. And to get a better perspective of this, we're joined by David Hightower. Now, he's been doing this, he's been in this line of work for 30 years. Now, David, explain to us how food prices, agricultural commodities, can be affected by extreme weather around the world, say like a flood in Pakistan or a flood in Australia. How does that affect how commodities are traded on this floor here in Chicago?
Well, we're trying to determine the future price for people that use these commodities. A lot of planning goes into putting these supplies where they need to be, when they need to be. And so this is somewhat a clearinghouse for information from the world. Information flows in and out of these pits, but more and more information is coming from around the globe. They're trying to help us determine what the value of those commodities are. And when you have a little bit of a threat from the weather, then we have to charge more for the commodities. We have to ration demand. We have to make sure we can get other alternatives in place if need be.
Right, and when you're talking specifically things like corn and soybean products that obviously have a direct impact when there's extreme weather around the world.
Correct, and it's a different situation in the last 2.5 years. We've had a number of minor issues, but demand has been consistently outstripping supply. So it didn't take as much of a weather threat or as much of a supply threat for prices to begin to escalate. Now, this also comes on the back of a much higher cost of production.
What of those commodities, the agricultural commodities, have the biggest impact? Is it corn? Is it soybeans?
It's coming from the food groups. It's coming from the industrial commodities. So that just shows us it's not in one area. It's supplies tight everywhere, and the world is really now coming to grips with the fact they haven't put enough investment. It's not speculation, it's investment in order to try and get that food in place for the world.
And now our interview with the World Bank, a group which says more and more people are falling into extreme poverty because of rising food prices. Tom Ackerman sat down with the managing director, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and began by asking how severe the crisis is now compared to 2008.
We think at the World Bank, after looking at our research and gauging what is going on around the world, that the situation is pretty severe. In the last quarter, we've seen the prices of oils and fats go up by 22%, and of grain, according to our food price index, and grains by 22%. And in the last 6 months, certain countries have seen really large increases in food prices of grains. For example, Kyrgyzstan, wheat prices have gone up by 54%, Bangladesh 45%, Tajikistan 37%, and I could go on and on. So we think it's pretty severe because tens of millions of people are being hit and thrown into extreme poverty, and these were the same people who suffered before in the 2008 crisis. However, this crisis differs from 2008 in a couple of ways. The first is that this is much more weather related than we had in 2008. But the second, the somewhat good news about it is that it seems that global food stocks are somewhat better, and we've not had as many export restrictions thrown in, so that trade in food is moving much better than before.
Can we say that this is a function of less supply, more demand, or is it a mixture of both?
I think both. I think both supply and demand are critical factors. You know, on the supply side, you've got a lot of uncertain weather events that have happened that have curtailed supply. You know, Australia is a big grain producer, and they've had both drought and floods. China, we are watching to see what will happen with the weather events there, and so on. You know, so yes, there's been an issue. But on the demand side, there are also issues because a steadily growing long-term trend is increased demand for food by a much larger population than before, and also by income. There are some income effects because in several emerging market countries, people are wealthier than before, and they are demanding higher priced meats and fats and oils, and you need more grains to feed into some of this. So this is also causing you know, prices to go up.
Is this uniformly the case with all food commodities, or are there some grains, for example, that where the situation is more stable and more reasonable?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question, because in the 2008 crisis, the biggest impact was on grains. Grain prices shot up. This crisis, we're seeing, yes, grain prices going up, but also the price of other foodstuffs. So across a range of agricultural commodities, we're having this price effect.
You talked about the weather, but weather is cyclical, although people say that this may be a function of a long-term global warming situation.
The effect of drought and flood seems to be, you know, happening in an unprecedented and rather unpredictable manner.
Some people inevitably point to speculation, or if you like, hoarding, or export curbs by countries such as Russia restricting the export of its own wheat in the past. To what extent does that aggravate this current situation?
Well, I think that, you know, there's so many factors that play into this food price volatility, and no doubt there's a lot of liquidity in the international economy that is searching for investment. But I have to say that, look, we should focus on the issue of transparency as far as this is concerned, transparency of information, transparency of food stocks, because people often say, so what do you do? The point is that we don't always know exactly, you know, how much food stocks are available worldwide, because, you know, we don't have that information transparently. So it may be that in one country there's more than enough. And if we knew that, that would definitely have an impact on the movements of price in the market. So we need to get that information out, especially for the large producers.
What are the realistic prospects of some kind of humanitarian food reserves in situations like this?
Well, certainly, you know, Bob Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, you know, has proposed that we not only look at this transparency as a plank, but also think in terms of perhaps some humanitarian reserve. Certainly, when this type of situation happens, our concern at the World Bank is how to protect the most vulnerable in society, the poorer people, children, pregnant mothers. How do you get food to them in times of need? Because they're the most hit. And therefore, if we had at least some planning for some humanitarian reserves that could be used during the times of crisis, that would make a great deal of sense.
We've heard countries, particularly big exporting countries that you might call developing countries, Brazil, for example, which is a major food exporter, saying we should not panic on this, and we certainly shouldn't try to control prices, because this eventually will settle itself out and time will basically cure the situation.
Well, I certainly would not advocate panic, because panic doesn't lead to productive energies. We certainly would advocate great attention to solve the problem. You know, like I said, first thing is let's know what there is out there in terms of transparency of food stocks. Second, you know, let us make sure that no export restrictions are not thrown in so that food, particularly grains, are traded. Third, let's try to support the poor and vulnerable by putting in place safety nets. And we are working very actively on that in the World Bank with the poorer countries. And then fourth, support farmers, you know, to produce small farmers with seeds and fertilizer. We did this in 2008. It worked. We were able to support 40 million people with our interventions of 1.5 billion that we put forward in the short term. Let's keep that as an instrument. 40% of harvests are sometimes lost in countries because of poor storage. Now, if we could help solve that problem, then we wouldn't be worrying so much about food, loss of food.
Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, thank you very much for speaking with Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
And from the necessities of life to things which most definitely aren't, but are often viewed as such. The lucrative market for technology, particularly things like smartphones, is one of the most fierce battles in the business world these days. And before you say, well, not everyone's got a mobile phone, consider that 90% of the planet now does have mobile phone coverage. As the world's population approaches 7 billion people, the number of mobile phone subscribers is likely to reach 5 billion soon, which is 70% of the planet. And much of that growth is coming from emerging markets. There are 500 million active users in China, while India adds 6 million subscribers a month. We're going to talk gadgets in a moment with a tech analyst in London. But first, this report from Sonia Gallego at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona.
The revolution of the smartphone. The mobile device, no longer just a phone, it's a personal hub, opening up the world at the touch of a button. We bank on it. We use it to amuse ourselves and be part of a virtual community. Its technology can even change lives. At Barcelona's Mobile World Congress, tens of thousands gathered to spark off the next wave in the digital revolution. From gaming devices to 3D smartphones, the technology of the future has now arrived, straight into your palm.
You're going to see connections going at bigger and bigger speeds. So mobile phones actually getting connected to the internet at about 1 gigabit per second, which is really exciting. We're of course going to see new devices, but not just traditional devices. We're going to have everything in our lives connected. So heart monitors, utility meters, cars, you name it, it's going to be connected to that mobile network. And then the third big thing, applications. Everyone wants to talk about applications. It's a really exciting space.
Also, we've heard a lot about sort of using your mobile phone as a credit card. What's the technology behind that?
So essentially near-field communications, using your phone to pay for simple transactions, to get tickets, all of those cool things can be done with your mobile, and we expect that to roll out in really significant quantities in the next 2 years.
Big on the smartphone scene is the wow factor. Which device will have consumers rushing out to buy? With entertainment playing a big part in the experience.
The people who play games on the smartphones, their average age is around 35.
Is that right?
That's true. And most of them are actually female.
Really? So this is going to work a treat with perhaps more female consumers?
It will definitely work well with female consumers as well.
Well, one of the stars so far of the show has been this new phone developed by LG. It not only records in 3D, but it also plays out in 3D, setting a new standard for smartphones everywhere.
What we're seeing now is a very strong trend toward 3D becoming part of our regular, everyday lives. It may take a couple of years for it to become, to get into the majority of the homes, but we do not see this trend stopping. So it just made sense to start looking at mobile devices as a home for 3D as well.
And of course, not forgetting the effect of social networking in bringing about political change, as seen recently in Egypt.
Actually, Tahrir Square is a result of communication and technology. I was there myself for several days, and you would see people with their handsets all the time, everybody.
Driving forward a new age in knowledge and empowerment. Sonia Gallego for Counting the Cost, Barcelona.
Joining us from London to talk phones and other gadgets is Tony Cripps. He is a technology analyst with the research company Ovum. Tony, thank you for your time. I'm going to start with the Nokia Microsoft deal. It is either, and I can't decide myself, a brilliant tie-up between two specialists or two companies with fading fortunes and they're just trying to prop each other up. Which one do you think it is?
Well, I think if you look at the situation that both companies have been in around the smartphone and smart device space over the last couple of years, I think it's apparent that both have needed bigger partners to help them actually reach their potential. Nokia's been working with its own software platform for 10 years or so now. It was really looking for a next generation one. Microsoft has that, but arguably doesn't really have the hardware partners to reach the maximum market potential that it could. And I think in that respect, this is a really good matchup.
But what do you think they can come up with? The smartphone market has been, I won't say cornered, but certainly dominated by Apple. Google's in there, it's got its Android phones. Do you think people are going to want to, go in and snap up a Nokia Microsoft smartphone?
Well, I think the option of both together is probably stronger than either apart in the smartphone space at the moment. I think it would be a bit much to expect them to come through to lead the smartphone pack and get ahead of either Apple or Google with Android in the short run. But nonetheless, it does look like a very strong third partnership there, and a very strong play overall, I think, for consumers and perhaps businesses too.
And what about a quick word on some of the other players in the market? I mentioned Apple and Google, obviously, but your LGs, your Samsungs. Seems to me this market, although obviously wildly popular, is just saturated at the moment.
Well, I think you're right, and I think actually this partnership tends to remove some of the variation that there was in the marketplace. The Symbian platform that Nokia's used for a long time is gradually being phased out. I think it's going to make things a lot easier from the point of view of consumers to understand and buy the sorts of devices that they're looking for in future. I think with players like LG, Samsung and so on, that for them the longer term question is whether or not they feel happy being part of that whole Microsoft ecosystem, once now that Nokia seemingly has kind of moved in with preferential status over them. Nonetheless, they're strongly supportive of Google with Android as well. And in that regard, I guess we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Got to look at the flip side though, Tony, because we do like to count the cost, as it were, the effect of all this technology. Two levels. One is the market saturation, which we talked about, but also in a sort of an information overload scenario where we actually risk getting bogged down with too much technology.
Well, I think there's a degree of truth to this. We are surrounded by technology constantly, day in, day out. I think the real question, though, has become one of how do users of technology actually get to use technology in the simplest way possible. And coming back to the main thrust of this discussion, I think partnerships like those between Microsoft and Nokia will actually help people to use technology more effectively. I think at the end of the day, there's no real escape from it.
So it's just the world we live in now, or the world some of us live in, I should say. We're surrounded by information, we're surrounded by information technology. In business, it's become the accepted norm, and this idea of technology downtime is something we actually have to consciously make time for.
Well, absolutely, and I think this is a problem particularly for business users. We are expected seemingly now to add extra hours to our working day as a result of devices and applications like BlackBerry, for instance, that have revolutionised the use of email on the move. I think you're right. I think finding downtime in that kind of situation is difficult, and perhaps actually something that needs to be addressed both at the professional business level for those people that are using technology for business purposes, but also in people's private lives.
That is Tony Cripps talking technology and phones with us here on Counting the Cost. Thank you for your time, Tony.
Okay, thanks, Gamal.
And if your technical limitation is a computer with an internet connection, well, that is more than enough to check us out online. Start at aljazeera.net/English, hit the business tab at the top and follow the links to the Counting the Cost page. Episodes in full are there, as well as special web-only content. And then when you want to get in touch, look for @AJCountingCost on Twitter. Best way to get in touch it is. Share your thoughts with us and follow developments on the show. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.